At the moment, I'd say chaotic. What we have are a number of different business models, some of which seem to work for a certain period of time, but there's very little stability there. It's an industry which is trying to find its way forward. We don't have any perfect solutions for it. In Canada, it's facing issues particularly around Canadian content and whether Canadian artists actually have any place in our own market, given that so much of our culture is dominated from abroad. And the internet, if anything, has hastened that because we simply lack the regulatory means to control for any of those forces, having seeded them quite broadly about 20 years ago. And so that's kind of where we're at the moment. It's again, all of the issues, whether it's getting paid or getting proper exposure, competing in that marketplace, all of that stuff is very much in flux. It makes it very interesting to study, but hard to make any predictions about. At the moment, I'd say the major players, there's been a shift in terms of who is involved in the music industry, what actually constitutes the music industry. So you still have your major labels, you still have some of the broadcast chains are still have some measure of importance because they do bring in a lot of revenues through performing rights or neighboring rights and so on. What you also have, of course, are the telecommunications industries, whether that's Apple, but also equally important, Bell, Rogers, Shaw, TELUS, because that's the conduit by which most people are receiving the music that they consume. And in fact, increasingly in Canada, in fact, no matter how you listen to it, unless you're actually still buying compact discs or vinyl, chances are your listening is going through one of those companies, through their broadcast properties or through the internet service provider a wing of the company. So they're really entered into the industry in a major way. Now, apart from Apple, who really do loom large in Canada as elsewhere, I'm not sure that these companies are very aware to the extent to which they have this importance. And in fact, I think they would tend to want to downplay some of that role because if their access is the gatekeeper function that they, in terms of getting onto the internet, period, is broadly acknowledged, then you start to have arguments made for perhaps attacks on internet service, things like that, so that we can fund the industry that way with the fund programs through, again, an ISP tax or tariff, if you will. So they're some of the bigger players. Again, I'm not sure that they're aware of that, to what extent, or that they want to be aware of that. They would rather just keep providing the access, but they don't want to be seen as being absolutely fundamental to it. So it's a funny kind of situation. The government still has a role to play, of course. Those programs are still considerable, but even with that, I think the consumption patterns remain the same, and we mostly listen to American music, which is sold to us by the major labels. So, in terms of Canada, again, as we've been discussing, we have a very developed music industry policy, which has been put in place over the last 40 years. It is, to some extent, the actual existence and the state of how elaborate that policy is proving to be a bit of a barrier. So we have this strong connection between radio and recording. That is the basis on which the policies were created. And it continues to be the rationale by which they exist. So it's really founded on this outmoded model where, again, the quid pro quo of airplay in exchange for promotion in exchange for programming. That's long. Again, the vitality of that relationship has declined over time. There's a number of reasons for that, whether that radio for many years now has been leaning more and more on classic or gold format, so breaking new bands over radio is less of a possibility. It's also the case that all of these other networks have emerged, all of these internet services, which have very little to do with broadcast radio. People listen to music in different ways, discover it in different ways. The promotional circuits are quite separate. And then you have, again, the emergence of other kinds of music industry, live music, which is now worth more in Canada than the recording industry is. None of that is really addressed by the existing policy frameworks. Again, they're still very focused on funding the production of records, which are meant, by implication, to be played on the radio, and to so that they either by the airplay, promotes and causes sales of recordings, or the implication that you're going to get, royalties, performing rights and neighboring rights from airplay. So all of that means that we have this very elaborate system, but it is kind of precluding developing new ways of thinking about this. In some ways, you'd say, if you were starting fresh now, if you could develop a policy, that might also almost be helpful, because we're very locked into to the recording industry, and finding new approaches to dealing with music activity in different industries, whether it's live or music publishing, is not something that the existing programs are set to do. So it really requires a big change in thinking on their part. There's probably more action going on at the municipal level in Canada in terms of policies that really can address things like live music. They're better placed, as we were saying earlier in reference to Will Straw's idea that Montreal's cheap living and fairly open regulatory system contributed to the creation of a scene there. Well, again, those are areas where cities can intervene far more effectively. I mean, in that sense, that policy is entirely accidental, because nobody in their right mind would actually have a financial crisis to create a healthy music scene. But there are things that you can do at the city level. But all of that means that the federal policies, as they are becoming a little bit more marginal to the path forward. It's provincial granting agencies like the Ontario Media Development Corporation are looming a bit larger. And so, again, any shifts in policy are coming from outside of the existing federal framework to a large extent.